The observation log on Prince Rithaven's personal console read, "Remaining," and his sister's human husband was about to be humiliated in front of every fleet commander in the sovereign reach. Rithaven adjusted the collar of his ceremonial coat and watched through the gallery's viewport as the delegation ships settled onto the docking arms of the Etharis, the Imperial flagship. 7 vessels, 7 fleet commanders, 7 of the most powerful military minds in the known galaxy, arriving for the annual war summit, and every single one of them had already heard the rumor. The Empress Caliph Ven Thasari, first light of the sovereign reach, keeper of the burning armada, had taken a human for a consort. Not a champion, not a decorated warrior from a respected species. A human. A field medic from a border skirmish no one remembered. Rithaven had opposed it, privately, quietly, in the way that younger brothers oppose things when they know their objections will change nothing, with a carefully worded letter, and a silence that lasted 3 months. He had not attended the bonding ceremony. He had sent a gift, a navigational astrolabe from the old vaults, impersonal and expensive, and stayed aboard his patrol cruiser in the outer reach, running supply corridors and pretending the distance was operational rather than personal. That had been 11 months ago. Now he was here, summoned by Caliph herself, standing in the gallery above the grand stratagem of the Etharis, watching the commanders file in below, and trying not to look at the human sitting at his sister's right hand. His name was Garrett Hollies. He was perhaps 36, perhaps 38, Rithaven had never asked, and the human's personnel file listed his age in Earth Standard years, which Rithaven had never bothered to convert. He had dark hair cut short and practical, a jaw that carried a thin scar from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, and hands that were too large and too rough for a consort's. He wore a simple dark tunic with no rank insignia, no ceremonial sash, no house crest. Caliph had offered him all of these. He had declined each one. That, more than anything, grated on Rithaven. A Thasari consort wore the house colors. A Thasari consort carried the secondary crest on the left breast, the bonding sigil on the right wrist, and the chain of office that linked them visually to the ruling bloodline. It was not vanity. It was protocol. It was the visible architecture of legitimacy, and without it, Garrett Hollies looked exactly like what the fleet commanders would see, a misplaced human sitting in a chair he had not earned. Rithaven descended the gallery stairs and entered the stratagem through the eastern arch. The chamber was vast, a half-dome of reinforced crystal overlooking the nebula that the Etharis orbited, its floor a single slab of polished obsidian inlaid with the star map of the sovereign reach in threadlines of white gold. The commanders' seats were arranged in a crescent around the central podium. Each seat was carved from the hull metal of the commander's first warship. Tradition dictated this, and the seats were ugly, mismatched, and deeply revered. Caliph sat at the head of the crescent in the Empress's chair, which was not carved from a hull but grown from crystallized starlight by the first Thasari sovereign 8 centuries ago. She was taller than Rithaven by nearly a hand, with warm bronze skin that caught the nebula's light and gave it back with a faint copper sheen. Her ears were long and elegantly pointed, curving upward like drawn blades. Her hair was deep emerald, pulled into a severe military braid that fell past her shoulder. Her eyes were sharp amber, flecked with gold, and they tracked Rithaven the moment he stepped through the arch. She did not smile. She inclined her head 1 degree, the formal acknowledgement between siblings of rank, and waited. Rithaven returned the incline. He took his seat at the far end of the crescent, the prince's chair, carved from the hull of his first patrol cruiser. The metal was cold under his palms. He sat and he looked at Garrett Hollies, and the human looked back at him with an expression Rithaven could not read. That was the other thing that grated. Thasari could read most species within seconds: micro-expressions, heat signatures, pupil dilation, the faint electromagnetic pulse that most sentient beings emitted when they lied. Humans were opaque. Their skin did not shift color with emotion. Their eyes were small and steady and gave almost nothing away. Garrett Hollies's face was a wall of weathered composure, and behind it could be anything: contempt, nervousness, amusement, indifference. Rithaven could not tell. That bothered him more than the missing crest. The commanders settled into their seats with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this for decades. Fleet Commander Sareth Ven Dren, the eldest and most decorated, was the first to speak. He was old enough that his bronze skin had paled to a dull copper, and the tips of his ears had begun to curl inward, a sign of deep age in the Thasari. His service record stretched across 4 border wars, 2 succession crises, and 1 encounter with the Keithrani that was still classified above Rithaven's clearance. His voice carried the weight of 40 years of command. Empress. He did not look at Garrett. The Vethani border situation has escalated. 3 of our forward listening posts went dark in the last cycle. I have repositioned the 4th Fleet to compensate, but the gap in our sensor coverage is significant. The Vethani may be probing. They may be preparing for an incursion. We cannot distinguish between the two until we restore coverage, and the repair teams are 4 rotations out. He paused, then added, with the careful precision of a man who was about to say something political, I raise this first because it bears on the matter of your household arrangements. Rithaven felt the air shift. Every commander in the crescent sat a fraction straighter. Sareth had just connected the single most sensitive military topic to the single most sensitive personal topic, and he had done it in the opening statement, which meant it was not an aside. It was the agenda. Calith's expression did not change. Speak plainly, Sareth. The Vethani do not respect bonded pairs outside their recognized species matrix. Your consort is human. Humans are not on the matrix. When the Vethani delegation arrives next month for the territorial negotiation, they will treat your consort as a servant, perhaps less. Any offense he takes or any defense you mount on his behalf will be read as weakness, sentiment where strategy should govern. He paused again, letting the pause do its work. I say this with respect, Empress. The fleet does not question your personal choices, but the fleet needs the Vethani negotiation to succeed, and your consort is a vulnerability. The word hung in the chamber like a held breath. Vulnerability. Rithaven watched Garrett. The human's expression had not moved. His hands were resting on the arms of his chair, not gripping, not tense, just resting, as though someone had called the weather mild and he had no opinion on the matter. Rithaven recognized the posture because it mirrored the one Calith used during difficult audiences, the sovereign stillness that communicated control. But Calith had been trained in that stillness since birth. This human did it by nature, and the discrepancy itched at Rithaven like a misaligned hinge he could hear but not locate. Fleet Commander Teshani, the youngest of the 7, leaned forward. She was sharp-featured and direct, with bronze-gold skin and eyes the color of deep water. There are precedents. Empress Valeth bonded with a Korathi warrior 3 centuries ago. The court objected. She removed 3 fleet commanders from their seats and replaced them within a rotation. She let the implication sit. I am not suggesting that course. I am noting that this conversation has happened before. With a Korathi warrior, Sareth replied, his tone sharpening. A species known to the Matrix. A species whose combat record was documented across 16 engagements. The human was a field medic on the border. His combat record is a single skirmish that lasted 9 hours. His species has been in contact with the Reach for fewer than 30 standard years. He has no rank, no crest, no house affiliation, no military training beyond basic field survival. If the Vethani scan this chamber, they will not even register him as a participant. Commander Resson, who controlled the mining fleets and whose bluntness was legendary, turned in his seat. Sareth is diplomatic. I will not be. Empress, the fleet loves you. The fleet followed your mother, and it follows you. But every officer below the rank of sub-commander is asking the same question in their mess halls. Did our Empress marry a charity case, or was there a reason? He spread his broad hands. Give us the reason. If there is one, we will defend it to the last ship. If there is not, we need to know that too. 3 separate challenges Rithavan noted, political from Sorath, blunt from Resin. Teshani's comment had been a warning wrapped in a precedent. The human was surrounded. Rithavan expected Caliph to answer. She always answered for her people. It was the Thasari way, the sovereign's prerogative to shield those in her household from direct challenge. Instead, she turned her head slightly a quarter degree, the angle of permission, and looked at Garrett. The chamber watched. 7 fleet commanders, 1 prince and the Empress of the Sovereign Reach, all watching a human in an unranked tunic sitting in a chair that bore no crest. Garrett shifted in his seat, not dramatically. He leaned forward, rested his forearms on the obsidian table and laced his fingers together. His hands were steady. When he spoke, his voice was lower than Rithavan expected, quiet, measured, the voice of a man who was accustomed to speaking in rooms where people were hurt and needed calm more than volume. "Commander Sorath," Garrett said, "I understand the concern. You're right that I don't carry a crest. You're right that my combat record is one skirmish, and it wasn't a notable one. I was a medic. I carried a kit, not a weapon." He paused. "You're also right that the Vithani won't recognize me. That's fine. I'm not asking to be recognized." Sorath's ears twitched, the Thasari equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "Then what are you asking, human?" "Nothing." Garrett's hands remained still, laced together, unhurried. "I'm not here because I asked to be. I'm here because the Empress invited me to sit at her table. If the fleet believes my presence at this table compromises a negotiation, I will leave the table. I won't leave the ship and I won't leave her, but I will leave the table. You can seat me in the officers' mess with the sub-commanders. You can seat me in the sickbay where I've been spending most of my time anyway. What you cannot do is make me something I am not, and what you cannot undo is what I already am." Resin leaned forward. "And what is that?" "The man who treats your wounded without asking whose side they were on." The silence that followed was not impressed. It was calculating. Rithavan could see it on every commander's face, the quick assessment, the weighing. A consort who offered to remove himself from the room was either admirably pragmatic or pathetically subordinate, and every commander in the Crescent was deciding which. Rithavan decided it was the latter. He did not speak. He was a prince, not a commander, and the stratagem was not his arena, but he decided, privately and with the certainty of 11 months of accumulated resentment, that this human had just offered to shrink himself to fit a space that should never have been offered to him in the first place. And a small, bitter part of Rithavan felt vindicated. The summit proceeded. Sorath and Teshani argued about the Vithani border for the better part of 2 hours, their positions hardening and softening in cycles. Commander Kale outlined a new patrol doctrine for the outer reach, Rithavan's corridor, with sweep patterns that were elegant on paper and would be exhausting in practice. Commander Resin presented tonnage reports from the mining fleets. Output was down 11%, labor disputes had quadrupled, and 2 asteroid processing stations had gone offline with mechanical failures no one could explain satisfactorily. The agenda was dense, and the chamber was heavy with the weight of a fleet that was stretched thinner than its commanders wanted to admit. Rithavan listened, contributed when asked, noted the patrol gaps in his own corridor that Kale's doctrine did not address, and watched Garrett Holly sit quietly in a chair that had no crest on its back, taking notes on a personal console with the focused efficiency of a man who was used to documenting things that mattered and ignoring things that did not. Halfway through the tonnage report, Rithavan noticed something. Garrett was not taking notes on the tonnage. His console was split into 2 panes. The left pane showed the sensor data from the 3 darkened listening posts, the raw telemetry that Sorath had referenced in his opening statement. The right pane showed the patrol schedules that Commander Kale had distributed for the outer reach. The human had overlaid them on a framework Rithavan recognized with a start, a medical diagnostic triage matrix. the kind field medics used to manage multiple casualties in a mass casualty event. Each listening post was a patient. Each sensor gap was a wound. The severity was color-coded red, amber, green, and the pattern the human was mapping was not a military analysis. It was a diagnosis. Rithavan looked away. It was probably nothing. A medic playing at strategy, applying the only framework he knew to a problem that required a different kind of thinking entirely. The man was out of his depth. He was playing with tools he understood in a domain he did not. But the pattern stayed in the corner of Rithavan's vision, and it nagged at him the way a loose rivet nagged at a hull inspector. Something about the color distribution on that triage overlay was too clean, too consistent, to be a medic's amateur guesswork. It looked like the man knew what he was finding. The summit broke for meal rotation. The commanders dispersed to their delegations, their aides clustering around them with updated briefings and fresh complaints. Kalith remained at the head of the crescent, speaking quietly with Teshani about the Vethani species matrix, and whether there was a diplomatic mechanism to add humans to it before the negotiation. Garrett stood, rolled his shoulders with the stiffness of a man who had old injuries in his back, and walked to the crystal viewport. He stood there looking at the nebula, his console tucked under his arm, and Rithavan found himself crossing the chamber toward him before he had fully decided to move. "You're the brother," Garrett said without turning. "I am Prince Rithavan Venthasari, second heir to the Burning Throne and commander of the Outer Reach Patrol Corridor." He said it formally because the formality was a wall, and walls were useful when you did not know what you were walking toward. "She showed me your letter." Garrett turned. His eyes were gray-green, steady, unreadable. The scar on his jaw caught the nebula light and turned it into a pale line that made his face look older than it was. "The one where you told her marrying a human was a strategic error." Rithavan's ears flattened, a reflex he had not managed to train out of himself despite 3 years of diplomatic school. "I said it was an untested variable in a system that does not reward uncertainty." That's the same thing in prettier language. It is the language of a prince speaking to his sovereign. The meaning may be adjacent, the register is not. Garrett studied him. It was an unsettling sensation being studied by a species that gave nothing back. Thasari eyes broadcast intent, emotion, hierarchy, dominance, submission, trust, deception. Human eyes absorbed and returned nothing. Rithavan felt, for a disorienting moment, the way a patient might feel under a medic's assessment, examined, catalogued, measured against some internal standard, and gently set aside as not critical. "You don't like me," Garrett said. It was not an accusation, it was a diagnosis. The same flat, compassionate tone a medic might use to say the fracture is here. "I don't know you," Rithavan answered, "and I don't understand why she chose you. Those are not the same as dislike." "Fair enough." Garrett turned back to the viewport. The nebula cast shifting colors across his face, deep crimson, cobalt, a faint wash of gold. Against the vast, burning sky, the human looked small, unremarkable, exactly the way the fleet commanders saw him. Then he said, without any change in tone, as though he were noting a maintenance issue on a routine inspection, "Your commander Sarath is wrong about the Vethani border." Rithavan's ears came forward. "Explain." "The listening posts didn't go dark because of Vethani aggression. The failure pattern is internal. Cascade malfunction in the coolant relays the same failure mode I documented in forward surgical units during the border skirmish. The power cells overheat under sustained passive scan loads. The sensor arrays shut down to protect their core processors, and from the outside it reads exactly like an external kill. But if you pull the shutdown logs from the posts, you'll find the sequence initiated internally. The posts killed themselves to prevent a meltdown. It's a maintenance problem, not an incursion." Rithavan stared at him. "You diagnosed a fleet-level sensor failure from your chair during a tonnage report." "During the sensor data review. The tonnage report was when I confirmed the thermal signatures matched the pattern I'd seen in the field surgical units. Same manufacturer, same relay design, same failure cascade. Why didn't you say this in the stratagem? Garrett's mouth moved not quite a smile, something smaller and more tired. Because Commander Sareth just called me a vulnerability in front of 7 fleet commanders, and if I stand up 5 minutes later and correct his threat assessment, every person in that room decides I'm either showing off or undermining the chain of command. Either way, they trust me less, not more, including you. He glanced at Rithaven. I gave the data to Caliph during the break. She'll present it as her own finding. The correction comes from the Empress. The fleet's trust in the Empress remains intact. The human consort remains furniture. Rithaven opened his mouth, closed it, and realized he had no response that was not an admission that the human was right about the politics, and right about Rithaven's likely reaction to hearing the correction from Garrett rather than Caliph, which made the human right about 2 things at once, and that was 2 more than Rithaven had been prepared to concede to a man he had spent 11 months dismissing. He returned to his chair. The summit resumed. Caliph presented the Coulantrile analysis as her own finding seamlessly, precisely, with the data overlays that Garrett had built on his repurposed medical triage console. She walked the commanders through the thermal signatures, the internal shutdown sequences, the fact that the failure mode matched documented cases in the fleet's own maintenance logs. Sareth checked the thermal data against his 4th Fleet repositioning orders. The listening posts had not been attacked. They had overheated. The Vethani border situation was not an escalation. It was a coolant relay problem with a known fix. Sareth's face when the data resolved was a study in controlled reassessment. He did not apologize. Fleet commanders did not apologize in session. It was a point of protocol. He adjusted his repositioning orders, recalled 2 of the 3 patrol wings he had scrambled, and moved to the next agenda item. But his ears, the old commander's ears, curled and pale and honest in the way that old Thasari ears always were, rotated toward Garrett for a half-second. Not a glance, not a conscious movement. The involuntary ear turn of reassessment, the body acknowledging what the mouth would not. Rithaven caught it. He wondered if Garrett had. The first rotation ended. The commanders retired to their quarters aboard the Etharis. Rithaven could not sleep. He lay in the prince's suite, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Garrett had said the word furniture without bitterness, without self-pity, as though it were simply a fact about the world he operated in, like atmospheric pressure or hull thickness. Rithaven had expected wanted, if he was honest, to hear resentment. Resentment would have confirmed his assessment. It would have meant the human was suffering under the weight of a position he could not fill, and that suffering would have proved Rithaven's letter correct. Instead, the human had diagnosed the position the way he diagnosed everything else, accurately, dispassionately, and with a solution already prepared. That was the thing Rithaven could not reconcile. The human was not enduring his situation. He was managing it. The way a medic manages a ward, by understanding the system, identifying the pressure points, and applying corrections so quiet that the patients never notice the intervention. At 03:00 ship time, unable to sleep, Rithaven walked the Etharis's corridors. The flagship was enormous, a city in miniature, with 12 decks, 3,000 crew, and the kind of institutional silence that only very large ships achieved during the off-watch hours. His feet carried him, without intention, to the sickbay on deck 7. The lights were on. Through the observation window, Rithaven saw Garrett Holly sitting at the chief medical officer's workstation. The CMO herself, a Thasari physician named Velith, whose reputation was impeccable and whose temperament was famously territorial, was standing beside him, pointing at something on the diagnostic display. She was not pointing in the way that senior staff pointed at subordinates. She was pointing in the way that colleagues pointed at shared work, leaning in, finger tracking data, mouth moving with the focused energy of a professional who had found someone who spoke her language. Garrett was annotating the display. His medic's console was docked at the station, and he was cross-referencing something crew health records, Rithaven realized, against the duty rosters from the Outer Reach Patrol. He was mapping fatigue patterns, correlating sleep cycle data with performance metrics, flagging the posts where crew endurance was degrading faster than the rotation schedule could compensate for. Velith said something. Garrett shook his head, tapped a data point, and replied. Velith's ears went forward, the Thasari expression of being shown something unexpected and finding it valid. She reached across the workstation, pulled up a second dataset, and layered it over Garrett's analysis. The two of them stared at the combined display for a moment, and then Velith did something Rithaven had never seen her do in the 4 years he had known her. She pulled up a chair and sat down beside the human consort, and the two of them began working together, side by side, in the middle of the off-watch, on a project that no one had assigned and no one would see unless the results warranted it. Rithaven stood at the observation window for a long time. He watched the medic and the physician work, the human's rough hands moving data with the same precision his sister's hands moved policy. Velith's sharp questions met with Garrett's measured answers and felt, for the first time, a crack in the wall he had built 11 months ago. Not a large crack, not a collapse. A hairline fracture, the kind that hull inspectors flagged with yellow paint and monitored over time, because the danger was not in the crack itself, but in what it meant about the load distribution of the structure around it. He went back to his quarters. He spent an hour staring at the patrol doctrine for his outer reach corridor, looking for the gap that Garrett's triage overlay had hinted at. He found it at the third waypoint, a 12-hour window every cycle where the sweep pattern left a corridor of unmonitored space wide enough to fly a frigate through undetected. He stared at it. He had been running this patrol corridor for 8 months and had never flagged the gap. A field medic had found it during a tonnage report. That realization sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He ate alone in the officer's wardroom before the second rotation. The wardroom was not empty. Commander Kale's aide, a sub-commander named Tavar, sat 3 seats away, eating quickly and reading a briefing pad. He glanced at Rithaven, nodded the minimal acknowledgement between officers, and returned to his pad. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "Your Highness, a question, if you'll permit it." Rithaven inclined his head. The consort, the human. Tavar set down his briefing pad. He was young, sharp-eyed, ambitious in the way that competent junior officers were always ambitious. Sub-commander channels are buzzing. Half the officers below rank think the Empress has gone soft. The other half think she has a plan. The split is roughly even, and the uncertainty is worse than either verdict. He paused. What does the prince think? It was a direct question from a junior officer, which was either brave or stupid, and Rithaven could not decide which. The parallel to the Keithrani field commander's assessment of Garrett landed with a precision that felt deliberate, though he was certain the sub-commander had not intended it. "I think," Rithaven said slowly, "that the summit is not over, and that the prince should withhold his assessment until it is." Tavar nodded. "That is a diplomatic answer, Your Highness." "I am a prince. Diplomatic answers are my primary export." Tavar almost smiled. He picked up his briefing pad, finished his meal, and left. Rithaven sat in the empty wardroom and wondered when, exactly, withholding judgment had stopped being caution and started being cowardice. The second rotation opened with Commander Kale revising his patrol doctrine and Commander Ressen's blunt challenge. It happened during the force allocation debate. Kale was defending his sweep pattern, Teshani was questioning the ship counts per sector, and the numbers were tight, the reach was vast, and the fleet was not infinite. The atmosphere in the stratagem was tense and professional, the way it always was when commanders began arguing about how to stretch insufficient resources across too much space. Resin, who was blunt where Sareth was political and direct where Teshani was surgical, turned in his seat and addressed Garrett without preamble. Human, you sit at the Empress's table. You hear our force allocations, our patrol gaps, our sensor coverage, our readiness states. Every piece of classified information that passes through this chamber passes through your ears. If your species decided tomorrow to move against the sovereign reach, you would know exactly where to strike and exactly how hard. He locked eyes with Garrett, a deliberate, confrontational stare that would have made most species in the known galaxy look away. How does the Empress's consort justify that access? The chamber went very still. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to quiet. The question was not academic. It was the question every commander had been carrying since the bonding announcement, and Resin had the blunt courage to put it on the table where it could be answered or evaded but not ignored. Garrett set down his console. He looked at Resin without flinching, those gray-green human eyes, holding the commander's gaze, with the same steady patience Rethaven had seen field surgeons use when looking at a wound that needed cutting. "Commander Resin," he said, "I was a field medic at the Keithrani border engagement. 11 months ago, during a ceasefire negotiation that collapsed, I was in a forward surgical tent treating wounded from both sides. Thasari wounded on one side of the tent, Keithrani wounded on the other, in the same space, breathing the same air, because there was only one tent and the bombardment had destroyed the others." His voice had not risen. It had, if anything, gotten quieter. "Your species bleeds a compound that is toxic to Keithrani on contact. It causes respiratory failure within minutes. The Keithrani secrete a stress pheromone that causes neural disruption in Thasari, vertigo, blindness, seizure if the exposure is sustained. I had 14 patients, 7 Thasari, 7 Keithrani, in the same room. Every time I opened a Thasari wound, the blood vapors risked killing the Keithrani across the partition. Every time a Keithrani patient panicked, the pheromone risked dropping the Thasari. I built partition walls from surgical sheeting and rigged a positive pressure air system from a salvaged ventilation unit. I triaged by severity, not by species. I rotated between the two sides every 12 minutes. I lost 2 patients, 1 Thasari, 1 Keithrani, both from injuries sustained before they reached me." The silence in the stratagem was absolute. Even Sareth's ears had gone still. "I saved 14, Garrett continued. "When it was over, the Keithrani field commander came to the tent. He stood in the doorway and looked at the two sides, his soldiers on one side, your soldiers on the other, both alive because I'd built a wall of surgical sheeting between them and spent 9 hours crossing it. He asked me why I had treated his soldiers. I told him I didn't triage by species. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, 'That is either the bravest thing I have heard or the stupidest, and I cannot decide which.'" Garrett looked at Resin steadily. "That is when your Empress noticed me, not because I was a warrior, not because I had a crest or a bloodline or a rank or a weapon, because I treated her wounded and their enemies wounded in the same tent at the same time without asking whose side they were on." Resin's jaw tightened. "That does not answer my question about classified access." "It does, Commander. You asked how the Empress justifies my access. She justifies it the same way the Keithrani field commander justified letting me treat his soldiers after the ceasefire collapsed, because I've already proven under fire, in a room full of people whose biologies were trying to kill each other, that I do not choose sides. I choose patience." He let that word sit in the military chamber, foreign and deliberate and unashamed. "The sovereign reach is my patient now. I am not here to exploit your patrol gaps. I am here to help you close them." Commander Teshani exhaled a long, slow breath that was as close to applause as the stratagem protocol permitted. Then Commander Kale spoke, his voice careful and precise. "Empress, for the record, the patrol gap at the 3rd waypoint in the outer reach sweep pattern. The consort flagged it to me during the meal break. He was correct. My sweep pattern has a 12-hour window of unmonitored coverage at the third waypoint every cycle. I have revised the doctrine to close it. He paused. I am noting for the record that the correction came from a man with no military training, using a medical triage framework. It was the most efficient analysis of a patrol gap I have received this summit. Rithavan felt something shift in his sternum. It was not a dramatic sensation. It was the feeling of a load being redistributed, the weight of a conviction moving from one foundation to another, and finding, with a kind of reluctant relief, that the new foundation held. Sareth spoke next. The Kulantrile diagnosis on the listening posts, that was his as well. Caliph answered, yes. The old commander's ears rotated toward Garrett again, fully this time, not the half-second involuntary turn. A deliberate, sustained regard, the kind Sareth reserved for officers who had done something that changed his assessment. The human identified 2 fleet-level failures in 2 rotations that our own analysts had not flagged. The listening post misdiagnosis would have resulted in a border escalation with the Vethani that could have cost us the negotiation and possibly started a war we cannot afford. He paused. His voice, when it came, carried a weight Rithavan had never heard from the old commander before. I withdraw the word vulnerability. In 40 years of command, Sareth had never withdrawn a word in session. It was, in the formal language of the stratagem, the closest thing to an apology the protocol allowed, and every commander in the Crescent understood its weight. The silence that followed was not the silence of people waiting for the next agenda item. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Commander Dersh, who had said nothing for the entire summit, the quiet one, the intelligence chief, the one whose opinion Rithavan had learned to watch for because it arrived last and carried the most, leaned back in his carved hull-metal chair and spoke for the first time. The Kulantrile analysis, the patrol gap, both identified by the consort using a medical diagnostic framework applied to military data. His voice was soft, precise, the voice of a man who spent his career listening. I want to understand the methodology. Consort, walk me through it. It was the first time any commander had used the word consort without making it sound like an insult. Garrett turned his console so Dersh could see the display. It's a triage matrix, Commander. In field medicine, when you have more patients than you can treat, you categorize them by severity and treatability. Red means critical, intervene now or lose the patient. Amber means serious but stable, can wait but not indefinitely. Green means minor, will heal on its own. I applied the same categories to your fleet data. Each listening post is a patient. Each patrol gap is a wound. Each maintenance backlog is a chronic condition. He pointed to a cluster of red markers on the outer reach. Your outer reach has 3 red markers, the third waypoint gap. A relay station running on backup power for 9 weeks without a maintenance rotation, and a crew fatigue pattern at Station Kethvar that will result in a critical error within 2 cycles if the rotation schedule isn't adjusted. Dersh stared at the display. Station Kethvar is not in any of our risk assessments. It wouldn't be. Your risk assessments are built on equipment readiness and threat proximity. They don't factor crew fatigue as a variable. A medical triage matrix does, because in medicine the operator is part of the system. A tired surgeon kills patients. A tired sensor operator misses contacts. Dersh looked at the display for a long moment. Then he looked at Caliph. Empress, I want access to this framework. Formally, I want the consort to build a fleet-wide triage overlay and present it to my intelligence staff within the month. The request hung in the air. It was not a concession. It was not a gesture of goodwill. It was a fleet intelligence commander asking for a tool he did not have, from the only person in the room who could build it. Garrett looked at Caliph. She gave the quarter-degree nod of permission. He turned to Dersh and said, I'll need your crew health data, your maintenance logs, and your rotation schedules. All of them, unredacted. Done, Dersh said. Rithavan felt the chamber shift again. What had started as a challenge, can the human justify his seat, had become something else entirely. The commanders were no longer asking whether Garrett belonged at the table. They were asking what he could do for them if he stayed. Garrett did not react visibly to any of this. His hands stayed on the table, laced steady. But Rithavan, who had been watching those hands for 2 full rotations now, studying them with the same attention a hull inspector gives to load-bearing joints, saw the tension in the tendons ease. A fraction, the smallest release. The human had been braced. For 11 months, Rithavan realized, in this chair without a crest, in this room full of people who saw him as furniture, he had been braced for exactly this: the challenge, the accusation, the demand to justify his existence at the table. And he had answered it not with power or rank or a speech about his rights as consort, but with the simple, undeniable record of what he had already done, and what it cost him to keep doing it quietly. Fleet Commander Teshani broke the pause. "Empress," she said, turning to Caliph, "I move that the consort be granted observer status at all future war summits, formally, on the record." Caliph's amber eyes moved to Teshani, then to Sarath, then to Resin. She did not look at Garrett. She did not need to. Her expression was the one Rithavan had seen only twice in his life, the expression their mother had worn the day she placed the burning crown on Caliph's head, fierce, certain, entirely unsurprised. As though the universe were finally aligning with a truth she had known all along, and the delay had been everyone else's. "Seconded," Caliph said. Sarath did not hesitate. "Seconded, with the stipulation that observer status does not extend to classified fleet movements above Tier 4 without my personal authorization." Resin, who had asked the question that started it, added, "Thirded, drop the clearance restriction. If the human is good enough to diagnose fleet-level failures from a triage console, he is good enough to see the classified data that would let him do it properly. Let the man work." The chamber voted. It was unanimous. 7 fleet commanders, each of whom had arrived on this ship believing the Empress's consort was a liability, voted to seat him permanently at the table they controlled. 7-0. The motion carried without a single voice raised against it. Caliph recorded it on the stratagem's central log with a single keystroke. The entry appeared on the obsidian display: consort status, observer, permanent. BY motion carried 7-0. The summit broke for the final time. The commanders stood, stretched, spoke among themselves in low voices. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted not dramatically, but measurably, the way atmospheric pressure shifts before weather. Something had been decided that went beyond a procedural vote. It was in the way the commanders moved, the way their trajectories through the chamber had changed. Before the vote, they had moved around Garrett the way people move around an obstruction, adjusting their paths to avoid passing close. Now, several of them were adjusting their paths toward him. Commander Dersh reached Garrett first. He shook the human's hand, a gesture the Thasari had adopted from humanity's first diplomatic envoys, one that most Thasari performed awkwardly. Dersh did it with precision. "I will have the crew health data and maintenance logs on your console by morning. Do not make me regret the access." "Commander," Garrett said, "if my analysis produces anything that concerns you, I'll flag it to you before I flag it to the Empress. Your intelligence operation is your house. I don't walk into someone's house without permission." Dersh studied him with the focused attention of a career intelligence officer. "You understand compartmentalization." "I understand triage. Same principle. The information goes where it can do the most good, not where it would cause the most attention." Dersh's mouth twitched. It was not a smile. Intelligence chiefs did not smile, but it was the absence of a frown which, from Dersh, was high praise. He nodded once and walked away. Resin passed next, pausing just long enough to clap Garrett on the shoulder, a gesture so physically forceful that the human shifted half a step. Resin was built like the asteroid processing equipment he commanded, broad, heavy, designed for impact. "You're not furniture, medic. I was wrong about that." He did not apologize. He stated the correction and moved on, because Resin had never in his career wasted a word on something he had already said. Teshani lingered. She stood beside Garrett at the viewport for a moment, looking at the nebula, and said something too quiet for Rithavan to hear. Whatever it was, Garrett answered with a nod, and Teshani's expression shifted, the hard, professional mask of the youngest fleet commander softening into something that looked, for a brief moment, like relief. As though she had been carrying the weight of defending the Empress's choice in private conversations with other officers, and the vote had just lifted that weight from her shoulders. Then Sarath approached. The old commander and the young medic faced each other, and the chamber was quiet enough that Rithavan, still in the gallery above, could hear every word. "The Keithrani field commander," Sarath said, "the one who called you brave or stupid, what happened to him?" "He survived the engagement," Garrett said. "He sent me a message 3 months later. One sentence: 'I have instructed my medics to adopt your triage protocol.'" Sarath was quiet for a moment. His old ears rotated forward, the open, receptive position, the one that Thasari adopted unconsciously when they were hearing something that mattered. "How many lives has that protocol saved since then?" Sarath asked. "I don't know," Garrett said. "I don't track it. The point of a triage protocol isn't to count saves. It's to make sure the next medic who walks into a tent with 14 patients and 2 species has a system that works instead of having to invent one under fire." Sarath's mouth tightened, not displeasure, the Thasari expression of being deeply moved and refusing to show it, which paradoxically made the emotion more visible, the way a closed fist draws more attention to itself than an open hand. "I will instruct my Fleet Medical Corps to adopt it as well, formally. Fleet-wide implementation." "Commander," Garrett said, and his voice had a roughness to it that Rithavan had not heard before, "that would save more lives than anything I've done on this ship." "That," Sarath said, inclining his head 1 degree, the formal acknowledgement reserved for equals of rank, "is precisely the point." And he walked away without looking back, his old boots striking the obsidian floor with the steady rhythm of a man who had been walking the decks of warships for 40 years and intended to walk them for 40 more. Rithavan stood in the gallery above the emptying stratagem and let the jealousy finish its first transformation. It was not gone. It had not dissolved or been argued away. It had become something more uncomfortable, the recognition that he had been wrong, and that the evidence had been in front of him for 11 months, and that he had refused to see it because seeing it would mean admitting that his sister's judgment was better than his. It would mean admitting that a human field medic, scarred, unranked, quiet, understood something about duty that a prince of the burning throne did not. He had to move. He descended the gallery stairs, but instead of crossing directly to the viewport where Caliph and Garrett stood, he stopped at the central podium. The stratagem's observation log was still displayed on the obsidian surface, the running record of every motion, every vote, every statement made during the summit. He scrolled back through 3 rotations of entries and read them the way he should have read Garrett Holly's from the beginning, as data, not as a threat. The log told a story that Rithavan's jealousy had prevented him from seeing in real time. Rotation 1. The consort sat silently through 6 hours of debate, took notes on a medical triage console, identified a fleet-level sensor failure, and passed the analysis to the Empress without claiming credit. Rotation 2. The consort closed a patrol gap in the outer reach, corrected the chief medical officer's crew fatigue models in the sickbay at 0300, and sat through a direct accusation of being a security threat without raising his voice. Rotation 3. The consort explained his methodology to 7 fleet commanders, accepted observer status without celebration, and was currently standing at a viewport looking at a nebula as though he had not just been unanimously voted into the most exclusive military body in the sovereign reach. The record was clear. The record had always been clear. Rithavan had simply refused to read it. He thought about the sub-commander in the wardroom Tavar who had asked what the prince thought. Half the officers thought the Empress had gone soft. The other half thought she had a plan. Rithavan understood now that both assessments were wrong. Caliph had not gone soft, and she had not enacted a plan. She had done something more fundamental than either. She had recognized a man whose value could not be measured by the systems the fleet used to measure value, and she had placed him where he could demonstrate it. The rest was patience. He thought about Velith in the sickbay, pulling up a chair to work beside a human consort at 0300, about Sareth's involuntary ear turn, about Dersh requesting the triage framework, about Resin clapping Garrett's shoulder hard enough to move him. None of these people were sentimental. None of them were prone to charity. They were fleet officers and military physicians who had spent their careers in environments where competence was the only currency that held its value. And one by one, rotation by rotation, they had looked at the human in the unranked tunic and seen what Caliph had seen 11 months ago. A man whose competence was so deep and so quiet that you had to watch him work to understand it, and once you understood it, you could not unsee it. Rithavan closed the observation log and crossed the chamber. His boots rang on the obsidian floor, the only sound in the vast, empty room. Caliph and Garrett stood at the crystal viewport, side by side. They were not touching. The Thasari sovereign's bond was not expressed through touch in public. It was expressed through proximity, through the angle of the body, through the way the eyes held. Caliph stood beside Garrett, and the line of her shoulder was exactly parallel to his, and the space between them was the most charged distance Rithavan had ever witnessed between two people. 4 inches, perhaps 6, and everything that needed to be said was in those inches. "I owe you an apology," Rithavan said to Garrett. He said it in formal Thasari, the register reserved for addressing equals of house. It was the first time he had used that register with the human. Garrett's brow moved a 1/4 inch, the human equivalent of surprise. For what specifically? All of it, the letter, the 11 months, the navigational astrolabe I sent instead of attending. The way I have watched you for 3 rotations, looking for the flaw that would prove my objection was justified. Rithavan paused. He felt the words assembling not as duty, not as protocol, but as something earned through 3 days of watching a man be underestimated and respond with competence so quiet it was nearly invisible. I watched you sit in a room full of commanders who wanted you gone, and you did not fight them. You did not argue. You did not assert your position or demand respect. You diagnosed their failures, corrected their assessments, closed their patrol gaps, and then you let my sister present your work as her own, because you understood that the fleet's trust in her mattered more than their recognition of you. Garrett said nothing. He was listening the way medics listened, completely, without interrupting, with the patience of someone who understood that the person speaking was performing a kind of triage on their own convictions. "That is not weakness," Rithavan said. "I called it that. In my letter, in my silence, in every assumption I carried aboard this ship. I was wrong. What you did in that chamber, what you have been doing for 11 months, is the hardest kind of strength I have ever seen. You set your own pride aside so that hers could stand. And when the room finally asked you directly, you spoke with a clarity that made 7 fleet commanders reverse their assessment in a single session." He looked at Caliph. His sister's amber eyes were luminous, not crying. The Thasari way was composure even in the deepest moments, but bright, wet at the edges. The way nebula light was bright when it reached you across a distance you could not measure. She was watching her brother see what she had seen 11 months ago, and the expression on her face was not triumph. It was gratitude. "I understand now why she chose you," Rithavan said. "It was not sentiment. It was not impulse. It was not the gratitude of a sovereign for a medic who treated her wounded. She chose the only person in the sovereign reach who would put the mission before his own pride every single time without being asked, and who would do it so quietly that 11 months could pass before anyone noticed. Garrett's jaw tightened. The scar on his face caught the nebula's light, and for a moment the composure he wore like armor showed its grain not cracking but visible, the way rope shows its fibers under sustained tension. For a long moment he said nothing, and Rithavan understood for the first time that the silence was not opacity. It was control. The man was holding himself steady the way he had held himself steady in a surgical tent, with 14 patients and 2 species biologies trying to kill each other. Because if he let go, the people around him would feel it, and he had decided long ago that his job was to hold the room together, not to fill it with his own need. "I didn't marry your sister to be recognized," Garrett said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I married her because she was the first person in my life who looked at me and saw exactly what I was. Not more, not less. A medic, a human, someone who fixes things." He looked at Caliph, and the wall behind his eyes opened not dramatically, not like a gate thrown wide, but like a door in a small, well-lit room, showing everything in its proper place. "She doesn't need me to carry a crest. She needs me to carry the kit." Caliph's hand moved. Not to touch him, not here, not in the stratagem, where the walls recorded everything and protocol was the architecture of power. Her hand moved to the chain of office at her own throat, the Empress's chain, woven from the hull fibers of the first Thasari flagship, 9 centuries old, carrying the electromagnetic signature of every sovereign who had worn it. She unclasped it. "Caliph," Rithavan said. She held the chain between her fingers. It caught the nebula's light crimson, cobalt, gold, 9 centuries of sovereignty, compressed into a braid of metal that weighed almost nothing and carried the authority of a civilization. She looked at it for a moment, then set it on the obsidian table between them. "I am not giving it to you," she said to Garrett. Her voice was clear, carrying the register of a sovereign speaking for the record, for the walls, for the log that was always running. "I am setting it down. If you choose to pick it up, it is yours. If you choose to leave it, that is also yours. The chain does not make the consort. The consort makes the chain." Garrett looked at the chain on the table. The nebula's light moved across it, shifting, living, old. He looked at it the way a medic looks at an instrument before picking it up, confirming its function, confirming its weight, confirming that his hands are clean enough to hold it. Then he picked it up, turned it over in his rough, scarred hands, and fastened it around his own neck with the careful precision of a man who was used to handling things that were more fragile than they looked. The chain settled against his dark tunic. It looked wrong, a 900-year-old imperial artifact against unranked cloth, and it looked exactly right. The way a medic's hands look rough until you see them work, and then you understand that the roughness is the point. The way a field surgical tent looks out of place on a battlefield until you see the 14 people walking out of it alive. Caliph looked at her consort wearing the sovereign's chain, and her expression changed. Not dramatically, a deepening. The amber of her eyes went liquid, not crying. The composure held, but the effort of holding it showed in the brightness, in the way her jaw set, in the slight tremor at the corner of her mouth that she mastered in a breath. She had given him the chain not because he needed the symbol, but because the symbol needed him. Because 9 centuries of sovereigns had worn that chain as an emblem of authority, and Garrett Hollies would be the first to wear it as an emblem of service. And that difference mattered more than any title the stratagem could grant. Rithavan watched his sister watching her consort, and understood something he had not understood before. The recognition in this relationship ran in both directions. Caliph had recognized Garrett's worth in a surgical tent on a border that no one remembered. But Garrett had recognized something in Caliph that was equally rare, a sovereign who was willing to stake her reputation, her fleet's confidence, and her brother's loyalty on the belief that competence would speak for itself, given enough time and the right room. She had gambled everything on the conviction that if she put Garrett at the table and let the fleet see him work, the work would be enough. For 11 months, it had looked like a losing bet. Today, it had paid out. Not because Garrett had changed or performed or risen to some dramatic occasion, because the room had finally caught up to what he had been doing all along. Rithaven stepped forward. He unfastened his own crest, the prince's sigil, the secondary mark of the Thasari bloodline, carved from the same crystallized starlight as the Empress's chair, and held it out. "I would be honored," he said, "if you would wear this as well, not as a gift, as an acknowledgement, from the brother who was 11 months too slow to see what the Empress saw first." Garrett looked at the crest. He looked at Rithaven. And for the first time since Rithaven had come aboard, the human's face did something entirely readable. It was not dramatic. It was not a grand expression. It was the quiet settling of a man who had been braced for a blow that was not coming, and who was allowing himself carefully, the way you lower a load you have been carrying too long to set the brace down. "I'll wear it," Garrett said, "if you let me look at those patrol schedules for the outer reach. Your sweep pattern has a gap at the third waypoint that a field medic could fly a surgical tent through." Rithaven laughed. He did not mean to. Princes did not laugh in the stratagem. It was not done. The walls were recording, but the sound escaped him before he could catch it, and it echoed off the crystal dome and the obsidian floor and the empty crescent of carved hull-metal chairs, and it sounded, to his own ears, like a door opening that he had not known was closed. "Done," he said. He clasped Garrett's forearm, the old Thasari greeting between warriors, the one that meant "I see you, I weigh you, I find you equal," and felt the human's grip close around his arm in return. Steady, warm, rough, the hands of a man who had spent his life holding other people together and who had finally found people willing to hold him back. Kalith watched them. Her amber eyes were bright, her emerald braid catching the nebula's light, and the line of her mouth held the expression Rithaven would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not triumph, not vindication, but the quiet, immovable certainty of a sovereign who had weighed the variables 11 months before anyone else, and who had never for a single moment doubted the result. She had known. She had known when she chose him, and she had known every day since, and she had waited patiently, steadily, with the same composure her consort wore for the rest of the galaxy to catch up. Rithaven released Garrett's arm and stepped back. He looked at the human, the field medic, the consort, the man who carried no weapon and wore no armor and had walked into a room full of fleet commanders and made them reverse their war footing with a medical triage matrix and the unadorned truth, and felt the jealousy complete its transformation, not dissolved, not argued away, transmuted into admiration. The purest kind, the kind that arrives only when you realize the person you resented was, the entire time, doing something harder than anything you had ever been asked to do, and doing it without asking for credit, without demanding recognition, without raising his voice above the quiet, steady register of a man whose only weapon was competence, and whose only armor was the willingness to be unseen. "Welcome to the house, brother," Rithaven said. He used the formal register, the word that meant not blood but chosen. Garrett Holly's field medic, consort, the only man in the history of the Sovereign Reach who had been offered the Empress's chain and hesitated before picking it up, looked at Prince Rithaven Ven Thasari and answered in the only language he had ever needed. "Where do you keep the medical supplies on this ship? Your sickbay inventory was 3 rotations out of date when I boarded, and I have been too polite to mention it." Rithaven shook his head, and the two of them walked out of the stratagem together, the prince and the medic, the crest and the kit, while behind them, the Empress of the Sovereign Reach stood alone at the crystal viewport, one hand resting where the chain had lain against her throat, watching the nebula burn in colors that had no name in any language, and wearing the expression that sovereigns wear when the world finally sees what they saw first. 3 days later, The first revised patrol report from the outer reach arrived on Rithaven's console. The gap at the third waypoint had been closed. The fix was elegant, simple, and bore the notation style of a field medic's triage log. Each correction, flagged not by tactical priority, but by severity of risk to the crew manning the post. The human had looked at a military problem and seen people, and the solution he built protected the people first and the corridor second, and it worked better than anything that had come before it, because it accounted for the one variable that military doctrine routinely forgot. The crew were patients too, and their well-being was inseparable from their readiness. Rithaven read the report twice. He forwarded it to Commander Sorath without comment. The old commander's reply arrived within the hour. 2 words transmitted on a private channel, in the formal register reserved for addressing equals of house. Noted, concurred. Rithaven saved the message. He saved the patrol report. He saved the observation log from the summit, with its final entry recorded in the Empress's own hand. Consort status, observer, permanent, BY motion carried 7-0. And beneath it, in smaller script, in the old Thasari that only the royal bloodline could read, a postscript that Caliph had added after the chamber emptied, and the nebula's light had shifted from gold to silver. He was already one of us. The record is late. Rithaven closed the log and looked out at the stars of his patrol corridor. The outer reach stretched before him cold, vast, and for 8 months it had felt like exile. It did not feel like exile now. It felt like a post worth holding, because somewhere behind him, aboard the Etharis, a human with a borrowed chain and a medic's kit was sitting at a table he had earned, fixing things that no one else had noticed were broken. And the record at last was no longer late.